The morning light barely touched the fog that clung to the railway platform, a cold veil drifting across the steel tracks. Somewhere in that haze, a lone officer stood still, his gloved hand resting on a leather briefcase he had carried through too many nights without sleep. The distant rumble of an approaching train echoed like a warning, one he knew he had only moments left to deliver. Behind him, the war raged in patterns that once seemed predictable. Bombers came, escorts turned back, and the sky above Germany became a battlefield, governed by routine. But on this day, something had shifted quietly, invisibly far beyond those old boundaries. Reports spoke of fighters appearing where no fighter should be. Machines that should have exhausted their fuel were somehow diving out of the sun hundreds of miles past their limit. He had the evidence, he had the testimonies, and he had the sinking feeling that the air war was about to enter a new and deadly chapter. As the locomotive's smoke rolled forward and the doors began to close, a single thought pressed on him more heavily than the rank he carried. What happens to a nation at war when its leaders refuse to believe the truth? The weeks that followed August 17th made one truth impossible to ignore. The pattern Galen had warned about was no longer an anomaly. It was becoming the new reality of the air war. American fighters were appearing deeper sooner and in greater numbers than the Luftwaffe had ever anticipated. In early September, the shift became unmistakable. During the September 6th raid on Stuttgart, Major Egon Mayer, one of Germany's most innovative bomber destroyers, led his squadron into a textbook head-on assault. Mayer had perfected the tactic, understanding that frontal attacks minimize exposure to the dense defensive fire of American heavy bombers. His men approached the formation with precision, timing their dive to strike at the most vulnerable angle. But before the attack could fully develop, P-38 Lightnings plunged down from altitude positioned above and behind the bomber stream, exactly where German doctrine assumed no escorts could be. The result was chaos. 3 German fighters were shot down in the first pass. Mayer himself survived only by forcing his Bf-109 into a near vertical dive, pushing the airframe to its limits to outrun the heavier American fighter. He returned to base, shaking his squadron, shattered his tactics undone by a threat his superiors had insisted did not exist. Throughout September and October, similar encounters repeated across the Reich. German pilots launched attacks under the assumption that escorts would turn back at predictable points, only to be met by American fighters lying in wait. Some units lost a quarter of their strength in a single day. The Luftwaffe's most experienced aces found themselves fighting not only exhausted machines and overwhelming numbers, but a battlefield that no longer behaved according to their expectations. Then came Black Thursday, October 14, 1943, the second Schweinfurt raid. 60 American bombers were shot down, a devastating loss for the 8th Air Force. But the German cause told a deeper story. 38 fighters lost, 42 pilots killed or wounded. Before long-range escorts arrived, the Luftwaffe could destroy 3 or 4 bombers for every fighter it sacrificed. By mid-October, that exchange rate had deteriorated to nearly 1-to-1. For Galen, the numbers carried a warning louder than any engine roar. Month by month, Luftwaffe losses were climbing. 87 fighters in June, 106 in July, 174 in August, 193 in September, 224 in October. The mathematics of attrition were turning against Germany. The Reich could replace aircraft. It could not replace pilots with 3 or 4 years of combat experience. Every seasoned pilot loss represented not just a missing cockpit, but a vanished instructor, someone who could have trained the next generation to survive. And then in December 1943, the war shifted once more. A new silhouette appeared over Europe, sleek, fast, balanced, and lethal at altitude. The P-51 Mustang equipped with the British Merlin engine had arrived. With it came a realization. Galen had feared from the moment he stood on that railway platform. The Americans had not only solved the range problem, they had introduced a fighter capable of outclimbing, outturning, and outlasting nearly everything the Luftwaffe could put into the air. The window of vulnerability the Luftwaffe relied upon had closed. A new era of air combat had begun, and it favored the side willing to confront reality rather than deny it. By early 1944, the consequences of ignoring Galen's warning were no longer theoretical. They were written into the casualty lists that crossed his desk each morning. Pages filled with names he had once known as confident young pilots now marked killed, missing, or wounded. The Luftwaffe was bleeding out, and the bleeding was accelerating. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang transformed that pressure into collapse. The Mustang was not just another escort. It was the instrument that closed the final gap in the American strategy. With the Merlin engine and external drop tanks, it could fly to the heart of Germany, fight there, and still return home. For the first time, American bombers had continuous high-altitude escort from takeoff to target and back. The Luftwaffe had no sanctuary left. In February 1944, the Americans demonstrated what this meant in practice. Operation Argument Big Week. For 6 relentless days, more than 3,500 American bombers struck aircraft factories across the Reich. Surrounding them were swarms of P-38s, P-47s, and P-51s. The Luftwaffe threw every available fighter into the battle, including veterans who had survived since 1940. They flew multiple sorties per day, often with barely enough fuel to reach altitude. New pilots, some with fewer than 200 total flight hours, followed behind them. The outcome was catastrophic. The Luftwaffe lost 262 fighters destroyed and 180 so badly damaged they could not be repaired quickly. But the true cost was measured in the pilots' roughly 100 killed, 90 wounded, 43 missing. Among the dead were squadron commanders and aces whose experience could never be replaced. What had been a formidable fighter force only a year earlier was becoming a hollow structure. Organizational charts full of units with barely enough trained pilots to fill a briefing room. And yet the pressure did not ease. In March, American fighters began pursuing German interceptors aggressively even before the bombers arrived. Mustangs waited near airfields, catching German aircraft during takeoff climb-out and recovery phases previously considered safe. Veteran pilots described the feeling as being hunted, forced into battle, on terms they no longer controlled. Then came the blow that shattered any illusion of recovery. The first escorted daylight raid on Berlin, March 4, 1944. More than 600 bombers crossed into the German capital, with 174 P-51s covering the entire route. 16 Luftwaffe fighters were shot down. Only 4 Mustangs were lost. The city that Goering once promised would never be touched by American bombers was now under assault in broad daylight. At the same time, the Luftwaffe's training pipeline collapsed. Fuel shortages meant flight schools received a fraction of their required allocations. Airfields were bombed. Instructors were killed or reassigned to frontline duty. By spring, new pilots arrived with barely enough hours to land confidently, let alone fight. Their life expectancy was 5 missions. 5. The Luftwaffe was no longer simply losing battles. It was losing the very ability to fight. Its future was being extinguished. 1 mission, 1 pilot, 1 irreplaceable loss at a time. Each loss tracing back to that morning in August 1943 when truth was dismissed as impossible. From the American perspective, the collapse of the Luftwaffe was not the result of a single aircraft or a single tactic. It was the outcome of an industrial and doctrinal approach that treated the air war as a system, not a series of isolated duels. American commanders understood that victory required more than courage in the cockpit. It demanded training pipelines, logistical depth, reliable fuel supplies, and an escort strategy resilient enough to withstand catastrophic losses like those at Schweinfurt, where German leadership clung to assumptions the Americans adapted. When early deep penetration raids proved unsustainable, U.S. planners did not deny the data. They changed the plan. They introduced long-range fighters, refined bomber formations, and under General James Doolittle revised escort doctrine itself. Fighters were no longer tied to bomber wings by rigid orders. They were given the freedom to sweep ahead, break up German formations, and attack interceptors during their most vulnerable moments. The goal was not merely to protect bombers. It was to dismantle the Luftwaffe fighter arm piece by piece. This adaptability reflected a broader Allied mindset. Britain and the United States viewed the air war as a long struggle of resources and endurance. Factories could replace aircraft within days. Training schools produced pilots with 400 to 500 hours of flight time, far more than their German counterparts. Even the political leadership understood the stakes gaining air superiority over Europe was essential, not only for strategic bombing, but for the cross-channel invasion that would decide the future of the continent. By mid-1944, that global calculus became clear. With the Luftwaffe weakened, the Allies secured the skies over Normandy, enabling the landings that opened the road to Germany's defeat. The disparity in sorties over 14,000 Allied missions on D-Day versus only a few hundred German flights revealed the consequences of years of strategic divergence. And as historians later emphasized, the turning point was not simply the arrival of the P-51 Mustang or the industrial might behind it. It was the differing responses to uncomfortable intelligence. The Allies confronted their failures and adapted. The Luftwaffe leadership rejected warnings and punished the messenger. In war, the ability to face unpleasant truths becomes its own form of strength. The inability to do so becomes its own form of defeat. The cold fog of that August morning lingers in the memory of anyone who studies the air war over Europe. A man stood on a railway platform with a briefcase full of warnings watching the train that carried his commander and Germany's last opportunity for strategic adaptation fade into the distance. What followed was not inevitable. It was the slow, grinding consequence of a truth dismissed and a danger denied. For Adolf Galland, the years that followed only deepened the weight of that moment. He fought on, tried to rebuild the fighter arm, pleaded for changes in training technology and doctrine. He flew unauthorized missions to understand the battlefield firsthand. He watched veteran pilots die and replacements arrive with too few hours to survive. And when the jet age finally arrived in the form of the Me-262, the aircraft he believed could shift the balance, it came too late, starved of fuel and trapped within a collapsing system. Yet Galland survived the war. He survived the Me-262 being shot from under him, survived political purges, survived the collapse of the force he once commanded. Decades later, he met James Finnegan, the American pilot who had brought down his jet. Their conversation, filmed in 1979, was calm, professional, almost gentle. Two men who had faced each other in the sky spoke not of victory or defeat, but of aircraft performance, decision-making, and the thin line between life and death. In that meeting, the bitterness of war dissolved into something more enduring: respect. Galland would often be asked when he knew the air war was lost. His answer never changed. August 1943. The moment he warned his commander about fighters appearing deep inside Germany. Fighters his commander insisted could not exist. To Galland, everything that followed was simply the unfolding of that refusal. The legacy of this story reaches beyond the Second World War. It is a lesson in leadership, in the danger of comforting illusions, and in the cost of ignoring those who carry unwelcome truths. Air forces rise and fall on technology and training, but they endure or collapse on honesty. So a question remains, one that echoes far beyond the smoke of those ruined airfields. In any conflict, what costs more? In the end, the enemy's strength or a leader's refusal to see it clearly? If this story resonates with you, consider joining us for more explorations of the moments that shape military history. And if you have your own reflections about leadership strategy or the power of a single ignored warning, share them below. These conversations preserve the past, and they matter more than we often realize.